It was just after 9 a.m. on April 26, 2014, and I had just set up at Alverton, Ohio, on Norfolk Southern's Detroit to Kansas City mainline. On the point of the westbound Canadian Pacific Autorack Train 147 was a single GE AC 4400, passing by the east end of the control point where NS Triple Crown Train 264 was waiting to be recrewed. Known as the Detroit District, Canadian Pacific held trackage rights over this former Wabash mainline from Detroit to Butler, Indiana, where its trains then turned onto the east-west Chicago line. CP, now CPKC, has used the former Wabash as a gateway to Chicago since 2005. Beginning in 1985 with the Soo Line, CP ran its trains over CSX's Père Marquette main line between Detroit, Grand Rapids, and Chicago, passing through towns like Plymouth, Lansing, Holland, Benton Harbor, and New Buffalo. Operating costs were high, the routing was inefficient, and CSX refused to let CP use its own crews. As a result, CP began courting Norfolk Southern to allow it to operate trains over its lines. That May, NS crews constructed a new connection track at the northwest quadrant of the Diamond in Butler, Indiana. This gave CP trains out of Detroit the option to continue west over the Chicago line toward Elkhart and beyond. By August 8, 2005, the connection track was complete, and Norfolk Southern symbol 29T was the first Canadian Pacific train to take it. The new route over NS shaved about 100 miles off the run from Detroit to Chicago, and Norfolk Southern allowed CP to operate its trains with its own crews. Back in 2014, the Detroit District was one of Norfolk Southern's busier corridors, hosting 20 to 30 trains every day. Originally absorbed by the Norfolk and Western in 1964, it later became part of Norfolk Southern in 1982. Triple Crown was Norfolk Southern's door-to-door service, using semi-trailer bodies that could move seamlessly between truck and rail. It was a clever concept, but by the mid-2010s, NS was focusing more on containers, and road railers were becoming increasingly rare. In fact, I remembered reading that in September 2015, NS announced it would only continue operating Triple Crown trains on key corridors. Thankfully, the Detroit District remained in service until Norfolk Southern officially ended its Triple Crown operations on August 25, 2024, concluding 38 years of service. About 30 minutes later, I saw another Autorack train, NS 289, rolling west with an NS-9 and a BNSF SD70 Mac for power. Not long after 289 rolled by, Triple Crown Train 264 was cleared toward Detroit with a fresh crew on board. Leading the train east was NS-9, number 9774, wearing the rare white face variant of the horsehead paint scheme. I'd always been fascinated by this scheme because in the mid-2000s, some Norfolk Southern -9s in the 9700 series were repainted into this variation. Unlike the standard white brow, which only outlined the number boards, this version featured white paint wrapping around the windshields. Although Norfolk Southern later phased out the look, it became a favorite among rail fans like me. I watched as the familiar GE exhaust haze drifted skyward while the train climbed the grade east of town. Its destination was Oakwood Yard in Melvindale, just outside of Detroit. From there, Canadian National would forward the road railers into Toronto. Once train 264 cleared, I headed south to Bryan, Ohio on the Chicago line, where I caught stack train 233 racing westbound toward Chicago.
Norfolk Southern, milepost 33.9 track.
Word soon spread of a special break-in run for Nickel Plate Road 284, number 765. I drove to New Haven, Indiana, and while waiting for her departure, I caught Norfolk Southern Manifest 14E rolling through. The 765 had originally been scheduled to leave around 8:30 that morning, but a switch issue pushed the departure back until nearly 1 p.m. While patiently waiting, I also filmed Norfolk Southern grain train 51T. Westbound 11E was following closely behind the 51T with an SD60 leader and a Top Hat -9. Once again, I saw 14E at Payne before returning to Casad, where I caught 765's departure. Another highlight of the day was train L75, led by former Conrail SD40-2, number 3352, with GP59, number 4633, in Norfolk Southern's Operation Lifesaver scheme. I chased that New Haven to Leipzig turn job between New Haven and Edgerton, Indiana. Finally, the star of the day, Nickel Plate Road 765, was on the move. She departed New Haven eastbound for Leipzig, Ohio, about 60 miles away. At the Indiana-Ohio state line, a friendly local offered me the bed of his pickup truck for a better view. At Payne, hundreds of people gathered to watch her storm on by. A Lewis Dreyfus lettered EMD CF7 was in the consist for backup power, just in case 765 had any mechanical issues en route. For reasons unknown, it briefly assisted near Continental, Ohio. At Leipzig, I watched 765 cross the Diamond just before CSX train Q241 rumbled through the interlocking. The classic B&O signals and the remains of the old tower gave the scene a timeless quality. An hour later, after 765 was wide just beyond the Diamond, I watched as the test train began its return trip back to New Haven, Indiana. Our last encounter with the 765 was in the evening at Casad, just east of New Haven, where the Historical Society's shop is located. Following her successful test run, 765 would deadhead 4 days later to Elkhart, Indiana, where it would pull the Commodore Vanderbilt employee excursion to Bryan and back. Just before sunset, I caught this power move on the Chicago line under the signals at Waterloo with the Top Hat -9 on the point. On the weekend of May 3rd and 4th, I chased 765's historic employee excursion over the Chicago line between Elkhart, Indiana and Bryan, Ohio, the first steam-powered train out of Elkhart since 1957. I found the locomotive parked at the Main Street grade crossing, right downtown, and in front of the former New York Central Depot, now used by Amtrak. It's also home to a virtual railfan camera, which captures trains arriving at and departing from Elkhart Yard. A massive classification and hump yard opened in 1957. It's one of the largest such yards in Norfolk Southern's system, with many employees who call it their home terminal. Before its departure, hundreds of people gathered to take photos with the locomotive, and Norfolk Southern's police were on the scene to make sure everyone stayed safe as freight trains continued to operate as usual. After an eastbound intermodal passed by 765 and her train, the dispatcher gave the steam crew permission to follow behind the high-priority train to Bryan, where the passenger special would be wide for its return trip back to Elkhart, a 160-mile round trip over one of the absolute busiest main lines in the United States. At Millersburg, Indiana, I saw eastbound intermodal 20E running at track speed with the Wabash Heritage Unit third out. Both the Heritage Unit and the STEAM program can be directly attributed to former CEO Wick Moorman, who championed celebrating the company's rich heritage during his tenure. west of Kendallville, I caught the passenger train at a rural grade crossing along US 6, which parallels the Chicago line through much of northern Indiana and Ohio. Just like in Elkhart, the citizens of Bryan turned out by the hundreds to witness history in motion. This was the first time since the American Freedom Train that a steam locomotive had traveled through their town, and the first to actually stop in Bryan since steam ended on the New York Central in the mid-1950s. In this scene, the train was passing by the Spangler Candy Factory, the makers of Dum Dum Suckers, and the former New York Central Freight House, now a crew base for Norfolk Southern's Bryan-based locals. Norfolk Southern owns a 1.5-mile-long industrial spur in Bryan, once part of the 186-mile Cincinnati Northern Railroad, which ran from Jackson, Michigan to Franklin, Ohio. Conrail abandoned almost the entire railroad line in the late 1970s, but kept short segments in cities like Bryan, which, until recently, featured a prominent rail shipper. As someone born and raised in Jackson, Michigan, I can't tell you how special this move was to me. Seeing what was likely the largest steam locomotive to ever ply the rails of the old Cincinnati Northern was an amazing experience. As far as rare mileage goes, this was as rare as it gets.
Get out of the crossing. Yes, you that's looking at me, get off.
Once clear of the west leg of the Y, 765 shoved the entire train down the east leg into the three-track Bryan yard. Once facing west, it departed the Fountain City for its return to Elkhart that evening. Not wanting to miss 765 ducking under the last remaining steam-era signal bridge between Toledo and Elkhart, I left Bryan early to record this scene at Waterloo, Indiana. This signal bridge was replaced by modern signals in May 2018. A true act of God, the sun came out from behind the clouds at the absolute last moment. After catching the train in Wawakayaka, I caught up with the Commodore Vanderbilt at Robert R. Young Classification Yard, where the employees and their families would deboard after an incredible weekend riding behind 765 on the Chicago line. Later that summer, I turned my attention to Watco's Ann Arbor Railroad, which was responsible for moving 765 to Train Expo 2014 in Owasso, On July 3rd, just south of Ann Arbor, I spotted a lone Ann Arbor Jeep taking the Burke and several passenger cars back to the Norfolk Southern interchange in Milan, where 765 then took the Detroit district to the Motor City for a weekend of excursions between Detroit, Michigan, and Toledo, Ohio. You know, it was really cool because July 3rd, 2014 was actually my birthday, my 18th birthday to be exact, and to have a steam locomotive operating practically in my backyard on classic railroads like the Ann Arbor and then on the old Wabash Mainline, it was really a special day for me, and I got to do it with some of my closest friends. I remember I was there with my friends Ryan and Sean. You guys might know them as Michigan Central Lions on YouTube. Just two great guys who live in the Ypsilanti area, and we encountered each other at a rural grade crossing just south of Ann Arbor and ended up becoming fast friends and chased 765 together several more times after that. It was really special. Lots of great memories and new friends made that day. At Milan, I saw westbound Canadian Pacific Manifest 241, which operates daily on Norfolk Southern's Detroit district via trackage rights between the Detroit River Tunnel and Butler, Indiana. Once 241 cleared the junction, 765 was permitted to make its move off the Ann Arbor and onto the Detroit district. We watched as the 284 carefully made its way around the tight curve of the connection track. In Romulus, I recorded 765 at 40 miles per hour, en route to Oakwood Yard in Melvindale. This was my final encounter with the steam deadhead that day. Over the coming weekend, I would spend Saturday and Sunday chasing the employee trips it powered to Toledo and back. On July 5th and 6th, I was on location in the Motor City to record 765 pulling the Mercury Limited between Detroit's Oakwood Yard and Toledo's Airline Yard. These were employee specials, with local railroaders and their families on board. I began my chase from atop the Fort Street overpass, looking west toward Oakwood Yard and the Marathon Detroit refinery. Operating since 1930, the massive Marathon facility processes up to 140,000 barrels of crude oil every day, producing gasoline, diesel, and asphalt. Over the years, Marathon upgraded the facility to handle heavier crude oils and invested in environmental improvements. Its iconic billboard made the perfect backdrop to the passenger train's departure. When the Nickel Plate Road 765 revisited Detroit in 2014, it was the engine's first time in Motown in 31 years. Its previous visit had been in August 1983, just after the NS merger. The last steam locomotive to visit Detroit was N&W 611 in July 1994, making these trips the first steam-powered excursions out of Motown in 20 years to the date. After catching the train south of Detroit at Wyandotte, I set up at Erie Road near Erie, Michigan, as the Mercury Limited approached the Michigan-Ohio state line just a few miles to our south. Since these trips were only about 55 miles each way, I could only get 2 or 3 shots in either direction. This was my last southbound shot that morning. While the passenger train was being wide at Airline Yard out of public view, I documented eastbound coal train 553 with 2 CP motors at Toledo's Amtrak station. Later in the day, the Savannah and Atlanta Heritage Unit was placed on the front of this coal train, although I'm not exactly sure where it was added to the consist. All I know is that it wound up leading the train through Cleveland, Ohio that evening. After turning the train at Airline Junction, 765 departed for the return to Detroit. I caught the iconic engine ducking under the I-75 overpass and crossing over top the Ottawa River, just north of Toledo, picking up speed on its way back to the Motor City. Monroe, Michigan is home to one of my favorite stretches of track, a pseudo street running segment where the city streets closely parallel the main line. It's not true street running, but it sure looks like it, and it's a popular spot for both documenting and pacing trains. Farther north, near South Rockwood, I filmed the train thundering across the Huron River Bridge. After recording the Mercury Limited, I also saw a Canadian National local train, powered by an EMD SD60, a former GMTX leaser. From there, I headed to Delray, on Detroit's south side, a gritty but historic neighborhood built on heavy industry. In 1890, a wooden interlocking tower was erected here to control a major junction point for the Père Marquette, Wabash, Michigan Central, and Lakeshore and Michigan Southern, along with a few industrial spurs and the local streetcar line. By 1906, the village of Delray was absorbed into Detroit, and in 1945, the current brick tower, built by the Père Marquette, replaced the original. For decades, Delray Tower was essential to moving freight on Detroit's south side, even in the 21st century. But CSX eventually moved dispatching to Jacksonville, Florida, and the tower was closed and automated on November 18, 2020. It remains as one of Michigan's few surviving interlocking towers, a relic of a bygone era. But back in 2014, it was still staffed, and a crowd of local rail fans, including the Borg family, came out to see 765 roll by the historic structure. Once clear of the junction, the train shoved back into Oakwood Yard, where the passengers deboarded after a rare mileage journey over Norfolk Southern's busy Detroit line. This run was one for the history books, as 765 was the last steam locomotive to pass by Delray before the tower was closed and automated. With the excursion complete, I headed to another Michigan landmark, the long-abandoned Michigan Central Station. In 2014, it had been vacant for 26 years, once the tallest train station in the world, then a hollowed-out symbol of Detroit's decline. The Ford Motor Company hadn't yet stepped in to begin renovations, and the building's future was uncertain. I wrapped up the day on Detroit's north side, catching a string of Canadian National trains, including one led by an SD-70. This area, known as Milwaukee Junction, is one of the city's busiest rail corridors, where Canadian National, Conrail shared assets, and Norfolk Southern converge to serve Detroit's many factories. Amtrak's Wolverine service also passes through here 6 times a day between Pontiac and Chicago, including the westbound train 355 I caught that evening. Amtrak uses Canadian National's Holly sub between Milwaukee Junction and Pontiac, the end of the Wolverine service. What made this section unique in 2014 was the jointed rail, a rarity on Class 1 mainlines in the modern era. At Milwaukee Junction, Amtrak leaves the Holly sub and takes CN's Shoreline sub to Woodward Avenue, and then the modern Amtrak station, which sits right across the street from a White Castle. After catching Amtrak, I went to East Baltimore Avenue, also near the White Castle on Woodward, where I caught Canadian National Train 280 with a faded Santa Fe -9 in war bonnet paint and a former Grand Trunk GP 38-2. Even with its colors almost pink, war bonnet 648 was still a treat to see. Not long after, a northbound CN train rolled by with an EMD SD60F. Built in July 1989, the SD60F features a cowl body with interior walkways designed for harsh Canadian winters. This particular unit served on the Aberdeen, Carolina and Western from 2021 until 2022. I closed out the weekend with two more trains: Norfolk Southern's northbound 29G, an empty auto rack train, and Train 121, a southbound led by a solo Dash 9 running long hood forward. The following weekend, July 12th and 13th, Norfolk Southern operated the Detroit Aero excursion. Unlike the earlier trips, this was a public excursion where rail fans and families could buy tickets for a rare mileage run between Detroit's Oakwood Yard and downtown Fort Wayne, Indiana. It was the first public excursion over the former Wabash since 1994. On the morning of July 12th, railfan George Dines prepared to board at Allen Park with his family. His footage shows the train slowly arriving next to Thunderbolt Lanes in Allen Park. Our first location was Romulus, Michigan, where the Wabash once crossed the Père Marquette at a diamond still busy today with about 20 trains between Norfolk Southern and CSX. My shot at Romulus may have been out of focus, but since 21st Century ended in 2015, an event likely to never happen again, I felt it was worth including. On Sunday, George Dines caught the train running fast near Milan, Michigan, next to storage tracks. Unfortunately, the train beat me to Britain on Saturday, so I had to settle for this quick clip from the car. Since the old Wabash runs diagonally, I had to outrun the train at twice its speed. With the passenger special limited to 40 miles per hour, this meant I had to maintain an average speed of 85 miles per hour to get ahead of the train. Just south of Sand Creek, I found 765 running at track speed again. Despite its small size, Sand Creek has an active railfan community fostered by Ron Williams. I intercepted the train again at Seneca, Michigan, near the state line. Farther south at Butler, Indiana, the Detroit district crosses Norfolk Southern's busy Chicago line. From US 6, I watched 765 approach the diamond while George Dines captured an incredible shot near the Butler bowling alley on Sunday, one of the best captures of the entire weekend. North of Fort Wayne, I caught the train at Graybill, Indiana, deep in Amish country. A beautiful but challenging place to chase a high-speed steam locomotive. In New Haven, I filmed 765 running toward NE Junction, where the locomotive and its support consist would be wide so that it could be placed eastbound for the return trip back to Detroit. This is an incredibly busy intersection with approximately 40 to 50 trains every day. Taking a break from the steam action, I caught a Norfolk Southern manifest freight in New Haven, powered by a Union Pacific-8 and an SD70M. In the afternoon, I set off to St. Joe, Indiana, where Norfolk Southern's Detroit district crosses CSX's Garrett subdivision. Roughly 70 trains cross the diamond daily between the two railroads. First up was a Norfolk Southern eastbound intermodal train. Roughly 20 minutes later, we saw our first CSX train at St. Joe, which would actually turn out to be our last, westbound Q147, bound for Chicago. With more than 2 hours of layover time in Fort Wayne, I went north to the massive Steel Dynamics plant near Butler, Indiana, where I found EMD SD40-2, number 3263. This locomotive holds special meaning for me. It was the second unit in my great-grandfather's very last train on the Southern Railway in 1978, and one of only a handful of high-hood SD40-2s to wear the horsehead scheme before being rebuilt with an Admiral cab. About 30 minutes later, I caught a westbound intermodal with a Top Hat -9 leading. Norfolk Southern had a total of 125 of these unique locomotives. While we were soaking up all of the railroad action Northeast Indiana and Northwest Ohio had to offer, George Dines was on the elevated Nickel Plate Road in downtown Fort Wayne, Indiana, where he recorded the 765 backing up onto the passenger consist for the return trip back to Detroit. I'm so grateful that George was there to capture this historic moment, and want to thank him for allowing me to share it with you here. On Saturday, George and his family rode the train, but on Sunday, he chased, getting this excellent shot of the train pounding the diamond at Butler, Indiana, on its return back to the Motor City. On 765's return trip, I planned to shoot in Blakesley, Ohio, and successfully recorded the train charging by the historic steam-era signals. Unfortunately, a hard drive crash corrupted my footage of that scene. A painful loss, as the signals are no longer there and replaced by a modern SafeTran system. I picked up the chase again at milepost 97 in Montpelier, Ohio, home to a key yard where the Indiana Northeastern interchanges with Norfolk Southern. Ironically, more than a decade after I recorded this, 765 has found a semi-permanent home on the Indiana Northeastern, running excursions across Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana, with a newly restored depot and museum at Pleasant Lake. Just south of Adrian, Michigan, I caught the train at the M52 grade crossing near Madison Center. In the foreground of this shot were my grandparents in the bright orange and brown. They were called to their heavenly home in 2019 and 2020, and this scene, my last from that weekend, means the world to me. The following day, 765 ran as a deadhead back to Fort Wayne with some of the passenger consist, concluding a successful 21st century steam excursion season. I returned to Adrian, where I saw this Canadian Pacific auto rack approaching from the south. I recorded this train just south of the Diamond with the Old Road, the historic Erie and Kalamazoo, the first railroad built west of the Allegheny Mountains. Soon after my encounter with the Canadian Pacific train, I caught the Adrian and Blissfield returning from Blissfield with a long cut of covered hoppers. Until 2025, the A and B rostered 5 EMD GP9s, later replaced by GP40s and SD series power. That same summer, I filmed Adrian and Blissfield 1752 pulling the now defunct Old Road dinner train, a unique dining and murder mystery experience that ended in 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. While some of the passenger cars remain on the railroad's roster, it's unlikely the dinner train will ever return. Back in 1994, rail fan Dan Cluley recorded the last Norfolk Southern steam excursion prior to the 765's 2014 visit. It was powered by Norfolk & Western Class J number 611. Here it is pounding the diamond at Adrian, the very spot I stood at 20 years later. Jumping back to 2014, I remember just before 765 showed up with its train, there was an older gentleman driving by with this classic 1951 Ford pickup truck. I flagged him down and explained to him that there was a historic steam train that was coming and that I wanted to use his truck in one of my shots. He agreed and parked right next to the railroad crossing and allowed me to walk away with this unforgettable shot. I hope you enjoyed this look back at these now historic excursions, and thank you for watching Delay in Block Productions. Until next time, happy railroading.